This video is my coverage of the 2009 Jen Sheridan film Brothers for PSY 300 Movies and Madness. Brothers was released in 2009, stars Tobey Maguire, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Natalie Portman. It is a remake of a Dutch film from 2005, put in a decidedly American context and in the broader historical context of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars after 9/11. Tobey Maguire, being Tobey Maguire, spent some time at a Marine base and an Army base talking to people about their experiences, both as active duty members of the military, but also to Marines. He did some grueling physical fitness testing as a part of orienting himself to the role, and he also lost a considerable amount of weight during the process of filming in order to produce the gaunt and ill appearance that was necessary toward the end of the film. Eventually he weighed about 136 pounds, and on his frame that is very, very slight indeed. Portman says that she spent time with military wives to talk about their experiences from the family point of view. And before I get into the film itself, I wanted to share with you some information just briefly, and I will post this document on D2L for you. Some information from a white paper written in 2014 by the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on reintegration issues. Specifically, the white paper is a summary of that office's perspective on stereotypes about military veterans. They start with the stereotype that I talked about in my other video for this unit, the same kind of issues that the study revealed that was done for Cut Your Six. The stereotype is that veterans are disproportionately vulnerable to post-traumatic stress. While many veterans do experience PTSD as a result of their experience, they're no more susceptible and no less than any other person from other walks of life. So that perception of extra vulnerability is unwarranted. Second stereotype, because of their combat-induced PTSD, veterans are actually a liability and will explode at any moment. And in fact, there is no research that consistently finds a correlation between PTSD and violent behavior. That's in fact an illusory correlation. The third stereotype is that veterans who experience traumatic brain injuries are permanently and irrevocably damaged. TBI has become kind of the signature injury of the Afghanistan-Iraq wars. And as the white paper suggests, more than 1.7 million mild TBIs occur each year in the civilian community in various walks of life. And most people with mild TBIs do not report long-term permanent effects. While the TBI issue among military service people is a significant issue, it shouldn't be assumed that TBI is actually more common in the military context than in other contexts. Fourth stereotype about mental health is that veteran behavioral health challenges are only, or they're more significant with this generation of people in military service. And that's really a mistaken assumption. So the assumption is that, PTSD rates and TBI rates and suicide rates are far higher among Iraq and Afghanistan veterans than in previous conflicts and wars. and that is simply not the case. One specific example, if you look at the current suicide rates among the military service people, the number of suicides that are reported, the most prominent group is people who served in the Vietnam era as opposed to the more recent wars. There are stereotypes about employment, and I touched on some of these in my previous video. There's a stereotype that veterans are not well educated. So there's this stereotype that when you have no other options, you go into the military, either because you're not smart or you have a history that has kind of ruled you out of the education market. The current generation of veterans, if you look at the data profiling those individuals, on average, they are above, either at or above what are considered to be normative levels in terms of standardized test scores. For many veterans, there's a history of post-secondary education or training, sophisticated training that they've received as a part of their military service. There's a stereotype that veterans don't have good job skills. So there's this stereotype, and in some cases this affects hiring decisions in the civilian atmosphere. There's some assumption that the skills learned in the military are not transferable, which has always struck me as being pretty ridiculous. In my experience, I've had not a lot, but enough to form an opinion. Some of my favorite students, because of their flexibility, their resiliency, their stick-to-it kind of nature, have been military veterans. And, you know, not surprisingly, I find the same thing about athletes. They're accustomed to having to do hard tasks on a schedule under time pressure. And I found that, you know, those are certainly skills that are assailable. There's also a stereotype that veterans are not going to be as productive, and part of that kind of ties into the mental health stereotypes that we have about veteran service. There's also a stereotype that veterans are so over-conditioned to take orders that they won't be self-starters, that they won't demonstrate initiative or the ability to act on their own initiative. And, you know, these are stereotypes, and these are all stereotypes that can be countered with actual evidence from both the office that produced this white paper, but also research on military service. And then there are stereotypes about the reintegration experiences of veterans. The stereotype of veterans and their families living in a very kind of rarefied, insulated world that isn't well kind of embedded into broader communities that are not military is a stereotype. You need to broaden your view of how military families live. Not all military families live on bases. In fact, the majority of service members and their families live in communities all over the country, and are actively engaged with their communities, as the report states. The stereotype that veterans find the world outside of the military overwhelming, and but at the same time have the capacity to get through any challenge because of who they are and what they've experienced, is kind of this double-edged sword as a stereotype. So that it kind of suggests that veterans, A, find the world overwhelming, and B, can handle anything. So that stereotype can be kind of a double bind. Now, given those stereotypes, and those are stereotypes that are endorsed by significant proportions of the American public, and I would argue that part of the reason why those stereotypes are so common is because of film presentations like the one I've asked you to watch this week. I asked you to start off your film reflection thinking about Sam as the film opens and kind of the family dynamics that are going on prior to his departure. Sam is presented to you as a military service person who has been deployed more than once. His wife does not want him to return. He wants to return. He has young children. His oldest daughter particularly does not want him returning to another deployment. And then you're given that really tragic kind of set of images after he's shot down and he's presumed to be dead. The aftermath for his wife and his children as they attempt to cope. Now, Sam's statement, and then, think about this from a story perspective. Many films in this genre tend to suggest that there is something almost addictive to military service in wartime. We tend to be kind of fed this narrative that engaging in warfare is exhilarating, it's exciting, it's addicting. And then there's a sub-narrative that suggests that the bonds that people have with their fellow service people is unique and special. Now that last bit, that's not necessarily a problematic thing. In fact, research talking to actual service people says that is one of the most valuable aspects of their service, is the deep connections that they have with their fellow service people. At the same time, though, the stereotype in these films is that camaraderie, that commitment, comes at the expense of one's family and the ability to adapt to quote-unquote normal life. So Sam and Joe are presented, as a commanding officer and who's a pilot, and they're shot down and taken captive. And Sam is presented with this horrific situation. They've been tortured, they've been starved, and you can see in these two images just the degree to which the weight loss is evident in Tobey Maguire's face and his pallor. They took great pains as filmmakers to make him appear fit and hale and tan in those opening shots, and then to show him being absolutely wan and gaunt and thin in the later ones. And then he's depicted as taking the life of his fellow soldier, who he is responsible for in this scene. And I'll pause here. I keep using the word soldier the way civilian people do inappropriately. I'm trying to train myself. I have my nephew's in the Navy, and he's like, I'm a sailor, not a soldier. And then Marines are Marines, and Army, they're soldiers. I apologize for messing that up. I do it kind of unconsciously. I'm trying to correct it. Okay, so the story includes a brother. Sam's brother Tommy is presented to you as trying to fix his wayward life. You're also given the character of the father, who's also a veteran, who is a hard drinker, who clearly has a preference for his son Sam over his other son Tommy, who has, he robbed a bank. He tried to rob a bank and he went to prison for it. His life has not been great, but he's trying to fix that, and the presumed death of his brother has given him a lot to think about. Now, Grace, Isabel, and Maggie are really struggling in trying to deal with Sam's absence, and Tommy feels like he needs to step in, connect with the girls, help Grace in whatever way he can, in part to, repair the crimes of his past, and perhaps, restore something of what his brother would have wanted from him in his absence. He runs into all kinds of conflict with his father, who dislikes him, distrusts him, and frankly would have preferred that Tommy die as opposed to Sam. Now, after Sam returns, you see through the filmmaker's eyes, you see signs that he is under distress. He doesn't appear to be responding to situations the way you would expect. At the same time, though, he meets every one of those notes of a stereotypical returning war veteran. He's edgy, he's angry, he's irritable, he loses his temper with his children, even though on occasion, especially the oldest child, seems to act out in ways that get him triggered pretty readily. He's also emotionally closed. Now, the pretty standard story narrative here is that Sam's got a secret. Sam's trauma is not just run-of-the-mill military exposure to combat. His trauma is because he murdered his comrade. And not only his comrade, but his subordinate, someone he was responsible for. So he has a secret, and for you as the viewer, the narrative suggests that he can't recover, he can't be normal until he unburdens himself of this secret. And it's all tied up with the fact that Grace has contact with the wife of the man he killed and with the son who bears that man's name. And it overwhelms him. The secret is presented to you as something that is eating him from the inside out. And he is very much that stereotypical military film veteran who is he's a ticking time bomb. Now, the filmmaker does, following the narrative of this story, deviate from what could have happened. It could have ended with him being shot by police or shooting himself. Instead, it ends with his brother talking him down and bringing him back into the fold. But still, the predominant narrative in the film is this guy has a secret, and until he unburdens himself of this secret, particularly to his wife, nothing is ever going to start getting better. Now, the final conflict in the film, as I mentioned, and if you watched the other video that I presented to you that describes more broadly the military veterans in film, the narrative in the story suggests that Sam really does need to unpack the secret. We tend, especially in American culture, in our war narratives, we tend to, especially and most of these films are about men who have served, and they tend to be presented to us as stoic men, as men who are brave, as men who are heroic, as men who are really strong and secure, and in some ways, very, very masculinized. Their trauma in the common narrative, their trauma and typically something they've done that is morally suspect weakens them. And as the story goes, Sam, in this particular case, has to tell his secret to Grace. So the person he most desperately wanted to get back to is the person that could reject him, could refuse to accept what he's done, could share his secret beyond the bonds of their relationship. She represents in many ways a threat to him and why he would hold his secret so close. The narrative also kind of brings in the brother, Tommy and his need to apologize to the bank teller. There is this narrative in stories about broken men that suggests that when they unburden themselves, particularly when they unburden themselves to women, they can heal. And what are they healing? They're not just healing traumas, past traumas. Tommy has had a traumatic relationship with his father. There are hints and suggestions of alcohol abuse and emotional abuse within that family relationship. So he needs to heal from that. He's committed this crime, so again, he's done something morally reprehensible, and the harm has been to a woman, and he needs to take ownership of that and reveal the secret and repair it. Same goes for Sam. As many of these narratives go, I know many of you watched American Sniper for your film analysis paper. It's similar, there are many times when Chris's wife desperately wants him to talk to her, wants him to talk to someone, but the narrative suggests that, doing so is going to be simply too overwhelming and too painful for him to deal with. So this is problematic because the overwhelming majority of people who experience post-traumatic stress and its related kind of cluster of symptoms have not done something morally reprehensible or even morally confusing in order to cause their symptoms. It's a stereotype and a really problem myth that we tend to believe that only military service people who have, say, committed war crimes or who engaged in problematic behavior, or if they're simply participating without question in an unjust war, that's why they have PTSD. And that just flies in the face of all of the empirical evidence that we know to be true. It's similar to the way when we have stories that depict post-traumatic stress as a result of sexual assault, for example, and the tendency is for people to blame the victim. Many of those narratives suggest, at least in part, that the person who experienced the sexual assault made choices that were morally confusing or morally problematic or just outright stupid, and then they are assaulted. So the war narrative tends to kind of build that in as a way for you as the audience member to kind of say, okay, PTSD makes sense if I think about it this way. If I think that it can happen to anyone, that means it could happen to me. So this is problematic because it's a part of a larger phenomenon in social psychology called a belief in a just world effect, where if we believe the world is a just and fair place, bad outcomes should happen to bad people, or at least people who've done bad things. And if the world really is such that perfectly good people who are in impossible circumstances, just being who they are, could suffer seriously bad outcomes, what are we supposed to make of that? That means that the same really, really bad outcomes could happen to anyone. So as I usually do, I ask you to think about where would you put this film on a scale from 1 to 10. Films like this are tricky because if you take certain scenes and you really look at them independently, you get useful depictions. Like the effect on families and on children is instructive in the way, in some scenes, in the way that it's presented. The way in which Sam's expression of PTSD symptoms is presented is in some cases instructive. The whole mosaic, though, the whole narrative, however, is very stigmatizing and problematic. And that concludes my coverage of the film Brothers.